In this video, I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important problem facing young men in the West today. It's a question I see people returning to again and again because it sits at the intersection of lifestyle, politics, and identity. It is at the root of the question, how should one live in the modern world? How should one conduct oneself? Is heroism still possible in modernity? And I believe this question is also at the heart of the so-called New Right, composed of young men who don't consider themselves part of the conservative or Republican establishment. Because of the increasing fracturing and niching down of identity, which you see in the West today, the New Right is made up of all sorts of people. You have traditional Christians, pagans, Nietzscheans, vitalists, regular conservatives, Evolians, Spenglerians, anything that you could think of, the New Right has it. Yet running through all of these different religions, ideologies, worldviews, and philosophies, there is one central question. Given that the modern West is in a state of extreme instability, given that our traditional institutions, religions, and moral frameworks have largely been destroyed, failed us, or been hijacked, should one stand by traditional virtue, morality, and civilization? Should one be a defender of tradition? Or should one throw oneself into the fray, wrestle with the modern world, play by its rules, and master it? In defense of the first position, you find those who gravitate towards traditional religion, conservative Christians, traditionalist pagans, anyone who believes that the path to a good life in modernity and the path to saving our civilization is to defend traditional institutions and virtues, reforming and revising them where needed. This is the path of separating oneself from modernity, of actively fighting against its tides and trends. Live by traditional virtues, find a partner, court them, start a large family, perhaps live in the countryside on a farm, isolated from the degeneracy of city life. Don't consume modern media or culture, immerse yourself instead in the ancient classics. Live as close a life as possible to the life of your ancestors. Be both an example for others to follow and a vessel for preserving traditional culture and lifestyle, safekeeping it for a time when the West returns to tradition. On the other hand, you have those who argue that this is an ineffectual and neutered approach to life in the modern world. One cannot shrink from the modern world, they say. One cannot deny it. This is cope. Instead, one must dive into it and wrestle with it. You hear this from vitalists and Nietzscheans especially. In this time of chaos, one cannot live a life of virtue untainted by modernity. Instead, one must become a savage, a barbarian, a wolf of the Mannerbund, a wild man without tradition or custom. You must become the barbarians who will found the new aristocracy, who will create something new out of the ruins of the old, and overcome the decadence of modernity by going through it. Get strong, eat well, but do not shun modernity. Experiment with peptides, maybe even steroids. Sleep with as many women as possible. Take advantage of modernity wherever it benefits you, and subdue it where it does not. Now, which of these two approaches one takes is one of the most important questions facing any man in the West today who is seriously grappling with civilizational cycles, decadence, decline, tradition, identity, all of these questions of meaning and being. Which of these two paths one takes will wholly determine what kind of life one leads and what one's aims and aspirations should be. I see people asking questions related to this on my channel again and again. Well, I have good news for you. Fortunately for us, our ancestors already answered this question. And in fact, it is the central theme of some of the most important myths and texts of the European pagan heroic tradition. This is why I spend so much time talking about these texts and why I have a course dedicated to them. They continue to be relevant even thousands of years later. Perhaps the most prominent narrative structure in European pagan myth is the breakdown of society into a state of nature, of war, followed by a return to custom, law, and order. This is such a brilliant narrative structure because it not only defines what civilization is and tests the extremes of the pagan moral framework, it also gives us a guide to the pagan metaphysical worldview. how they understood nature, civilization, and man's role in these, the gods' role in these things. And thus these works provide for us a kind of metaphysical, spiritual, and moral roadmap. The Iliad broadly follows this structure, as does the Odyssey. I've talked about both at length on this channel, but I'll briefly summarize here how these themes appear in the Odyssey to give you the basic idea, the basic outline. When the Trojan War breaks out, the moral fabric of civilization is ruptured, and society descends into a state of nature, into the state of the war of all against all. When Odysseus is at sea, he exists beyond Achaean civilization, where its laws and moral customs hold no authority. You might think this is common sense, but it is an important point, and one that is not immediately apparent to most people. If you go to a different country, obviously the laws of your country will have no authority, but furthermore, the moral, spiritual, metaphysical presumptions which you were born into and might assume are ubiquitous will also hold no authority. This is best illustrated by the Cyclops episode in Book 9. Odysseus and his crew come upon the cave of Polyphemus. His crew wants to raid the cave, take all that yummy cheese and wine, and leave, but Odysseus insists on staying and behaving as a proper guest, because reciprocal generosity and the host-guest relationship was among the most important values in Achaean civilization. The very fabric of their society was built on kinship ties, royal ties, friendship ties, tribal ties, alliances, pacts. This is why everyone goes to fight for Menelaus' wife Helen. Now, when Polyphemus returns, Odysseus quickly learns that he has no regard for Achaean morals, customs, or laws, and does not hold the laws of Zeus sacred or respect Zeus's authority as the divine sanctioner of these laws, of these moral norms and customs. Polyphemus explicitly says, "I don't follow the laws of Zeus," and proceeds to devour Odysseus' crew. Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, Odysseus' kingdom has also descended into a state of devouring nature. The suitors are eating up the wealth and provisions of his household, courting his wife, and plotting the death of his son. But of course, Odysseus eventually returns, kills the suitors, and restores order. And at the very end of the epic, when another war is about to break out between Odysseus and the families of the murdered suitors, Athena herself descends and restores peace. This is important because it brings the entire narrative of the Trojan War to a close. Order is restored, peace is restored, divine kingship is restored, proper ancestral continuity between Odysseus, his father, and his son is restored. The metaphysical pagan world has been explored across these two epics, its morals tested to their limits, and in the end, order prevails. In the end, we, like Odysseus, return home. Now we see variations on the same theme and structure in the myth of the founding of Rome and in the remarkably similar section of the saga of the Volsungs involving Sigmund and Sinfjotli. First, let's talk about the myth of the founding of Rome. And I promise you'll soon see how all of this is extremely relevant to our situation today in the West. King Numitor rules the kingdom in Italy, which was founded by Aeneas, the Trojan refugee whose story is told in the Aeneid. However, Numitor's brother, Amulius, usurps the throne, banishing Numitor, killing his sons, and sending his daughter, Rhea Silvia, to serve as a Vestal virgin. The Vestal virgins were priestesses of the goddess Vesta, goddess of the hearth of the sacred ancestral flame, and they were bound by an oath of virginity for the duration of their service, which lasted, I think, 30 years. So making her a priestess of Vesta would ensure that Rhea Silvia did not produce any heirs who could retake the throne. However, the god Mars impregnated Rhea Silvia, and she gave birth to twins, Romulus and Remus. They were sentenced to death and exposed in the wilderness, but they were sheltered by a she-wolf and rescued by a shepherd. Once they came of age and learned of their divine heritage, they killed Amulius and restored their grandfather, Numitor, to the throne. So again, here you have the complete arc, which we also saw in the Odyssey. The collapse of order, the usurpation of the throne, the descent into the wilderness and the state of nature, and eventually the restoration of the rightful king and proper ancestral continuity. But interestingly, Romulus and Remus do not simply take over rule after their grandfather. Together with a band of thieves and vagabonds, they found a new city and kidnapped the women of the neighboring Sabine tribe. This band of young men outlaws and thieves, become the founding stock of Rome, along with these Sabine women. Now, this is extremely interesting because based on reconstructed myth and ritual, based on linguistics, scholars have long posited that an Indo-European custom of expelling young men into the wilderness, where they would take on the spiritual identity of wolves, raiding and pillaging, eventually founding new cities and settlements, was central to Indo-European and therefore early European pagan societies. Some have theorized that this cycle of expulsion, raiding, and settlement is what drove the rapid Indo-European expansion into Europe, in which a majority of male genetic lineages, but not female, were replaced by Indo-European ones, creating the prevalence of haplogroups R1b and R1a today in Europe. Could the myth of Romulus and Remus be an echo of this ancient pattern? We also may see echoes of this in the Spartan initiation rituals, the Berserker war bands, the Irish Fianna, and some have argued that the same spirit persisted even into the colonial era in the pattern of expansion and settlement into the frontier. Alright, now let's talk about the Norse saga of the Volsungs, and this will really pull everything together. The saga of the Volsungs is probably the most important Norse saga, like the Norse equivalent of the Iliad, though nowhere near as long. It spans many generations of the Volsung bloodline descended from Odin, and stretches from the Gothic steppe of the migration period, shortly after the fall of Western Rome, all the way into the Viking Age with Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons, who you may know from the television show Vikings. Early in the saga, King Volsung, the grandson of Odin, is ambushed by his daughter's wicked husband and killed along with his 10 sons. Again, we see the betrayal of the king, the breakdown of order into a state of war. The only survivors are Volsung's twin children, brother and sister, Sigmund and Signy. Sigmund hides in the wilderness, unable to return by sea to his homeland, while Signy remains with her wicked husband and attempts to raise sons capable of taking vengeance for the death of her father. However, none of these sons prove strong enough because her husband is weak and wicked, so she eventually has Sigmund kill all 3 of them. She then sleeps with her own brother in disguise, and together they produce Sinfjotli, strong, cunning, ruthless, possessing everything needed to avenge his grandfather's death. Sigmund and his incestuous son Sinfjotli live as vagabonds and robbers in the woods while Sinfjotli comes of age. At one point, they come upon enchanted wolfskins and are transformed into wolves, living in the wilderness and killing men. I'm very excited for Robert Eggers' Werewolf movie, by the way. Eventually, the curse is lifted. They take their vengeance on Signy's husband, the killer of Volsung, but Signy feels that she has done too much evil to go on living, having ordered the death of her own children and slept with her own brother, so she lets herself be burned to death alongside her husband. Sigmund then reclaims his father's throne. This story shows remarkable similarities to the myth of the founding of Rome. In both, a king is usurped. You have divine twins, wolf symbolism, the time spent in the wilderness as robbers and outlaws. And if you've been listening carefully, I think you can see how all of this applies very well to our situation in the modern West. Right now, we find ourselves in the position of Odysseus at sea, of Sigmund and Sinfjotli in the wilderness, of Romulus and Remus in the wilderness. As young Western men, we have been disinherited. Our father's throne has been usurped. The moral and cultural continuity of our civilization has been broken, and society has returned to a state of nature. There is no legitimate ruler. Everyone is vying for a piece of the pie, like the suitors devouring Odysseus' household and plotting Telemachus' death. What does this mean for us? On the one hand, our goal should be to restore order to our societies, to restore the continuity of ancestry and custom, and to heal the moral and cultural fabric of our civilization. We share a goal, therefore, with Romulus and Remus, and with Sigmund and Sinfjotli, as well as with Odysseus. Tradition has been broken. Our goal is to heal that broken continuity. But here is the paradox, and this is the central problem that I was talking about earlier. In order to restore traditional morality, religion, and custom, even on the most basic level of getting back to functioning societies that work in the interests of their own people and are not set on a path towards self-destruction, we cannot rely entirely on traditional morals, traditional institutions, and customs. This is the great irony. To attempt to do so was Odysseus' mistake. By expecting Polyphemus to obey the same moral framework as him, Odysseus condemned himself to 10 more years at sea in the state of nature, 10 more long years of suffering. And the lesson he had learned when he finally returned home was to be wiser and more crafty, to conceal his identity, to employ trickery and deceit, to not follow the rules. We must take the same lesson. Odysseus could not rely on traditional morality to save his kingdom and his family. A significant problem in the United States right now is that heritage Americans tend to operate within a traditional American moral framework, but this puts them at a severe disadvantage because the other groups they encounter do not adhere to these laws and customs. So someone who is the descendant of settlers who built this country might say, I'm not going to act in favor of my group interests. I want everything to be fair. I want to abide by the law, the Constitution, reason, moral principles, all these things that founded the country, rather than personal interest and tribalism. In this way, they are being a good citizen, like Odysseus in the Cyclops cave, insisting on being a good guest. The problem is that almost no other group in the country abides by this moral standard. Even Italians and Jews and the Irish, although they've kind of integrated more now, were far more tribal and clannish when they arrived. When Italians came to this country in large numbers, and I can say this as an Italian American, they essentially formed tribal crime networks and took over New York City. Similarly, Jews have always had a strong in-group preference and tribal identity, and for understandable reasons. And Jews have no qualms about pushing for America to support Israel. Most people consider it perfectly natural that a group would act collectively in favor of its own interests, and play hardball when necessary to get what it wants, because that's just how people operate. The natural state of the world is a war of all against all, a war between different groups and factions vying for resources. If you look at the natural world at its most basic level, what you see is organisms trying to eat other organisms, or trying not to be eaten, or competing for food, for resources, for mates, for territory. And that is exactly what American society has become. It's returned to a state of nature. And if you behave in a traditional, moral American fashion, as Odysseus did you're simply going to be outcompeted, have your resources taken from you, and receive nothing in return for your decency, just like what happened to Odysseus in Polyphemus's cave. Odysseus didn't read the room, so to speak. He was thinking, yeah, I'm still back in Ithaca, but he wasn't. He was in the Cyclops cave, and that's kind of the situation you have going on in America, especially with the older generations. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you should behave completely immorally, abandon all virtue, or forego traditional religion or family formation or something like that. What it does mean is that if you fail to recognize that we are no longer living in a civilization, that we are living instead in the state of nature, in the wilderness, out at sea, then you are going to get wrecked. So you might ask, what exactly should we be doing? And I do not have all the answers, but like I said, I think these ancient texts can point us in the right direction. The model for young men in the modern world is the Mannerbund. Find a tribe of young men, train with them, go to the gym together, find people who have your back, form a network, strengthen and enrich each other, engage in entrepreneurial projects, get wealthy together, train jujitsu, uplift each other, create your own Mannerbund. You are in the wilderness. Act like it. This is important for 3 reasons. Firstly, on a purely practical level, if you live in a society where you can no longer expect your government or the average citizen to share your moral or religious framework or to look out for you, you have to build your own support network, one which you can actually rely on. Otherwise, you'll end up alone, friendless, and broke, completely isolated. This is what happens to so many young men in the West today. They end up like Odysseus on Calypso's island with his entire crew dead, stranded alone at the edge of the world. Calypso offers him immortality, godhood, endless food and sex, a life of luxury, which in the modern world we might equate with porn, video games, fast food, endless entertainment, and other cheap luxuries. But if Odysseus accepts that offer, what he gives up is his kingdom, his lineage, his son, his wife, his community, his fame, his glory, and his name. He would give up everything for the pleasures of being a god on this isolated island. Odysseus refuses, but I think we all know how persuasive Calypso can be. The second reason is that young men and networks of young men are the basis of political power. The way young men are going is one of the best indicators of how a country will go. If you want to enact real political change, you need a strong foundation of young men to shift the culture, to canvass for political parties, to enter into politics themselves, to infiltrate institutions, and to gather power. And in the worst case scenario, if society descends into actual conflict, it is these same young men who will keep things running, protect the women and children, and bring civilization back from the brink. We have seen this again and again throughout history. The third reason is that the tribe is the most foundational and durable unit of human social organization. Every other form of human culture and civilization is in some way either an extension of or a battleground between different tribes. Various factions, networks, cultural and ethnic units competing with one another. I think it's very possible that the United States stands no chance of becoming a coherent society again, at least any time in the near future. The United States is so vast and now contains so many different peoples and ideological groups with conflicting interests that it's hard to imagine any stable cultural consensus being reached or enforced anytime soon. Those of us living in the United States, therefore, are going to have to start operating again as networks and tribes, living within what is essentially a sprawling empire. Think of the Goths or the Jews in the late Roman Empire. In fact, the Jews are an excellent example of why tribalism works. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, the Israelites had no realistic prospect of reestablishing a stable society in the near future. Their cultural chain was broken, their civilization had been broken, and with the destruction of the temple, their religious center was gone, and so their religion itself had been fractured. Some converted to Christianity, which of course went on to become enormously successful, but those who didn't adapted their religion into something wholly tribal. Their religion became the ancestral faith of the modern Jewish people, that is, Rabbinic Judaism, and that tribal approach allowed them to maintain ancestral continuity, a cohesive religious framework, and a distinct identity, and eventually to reclaim their ancestral homeland and establish a sovereign state there. Without their tribalism, they would not have survived as a distinct ethnic and cultural group. They would have just been absorbed into the Near Eastern diaspora. So if you're interested in preserving traditional Western culture in the United States or a different Western country, whether you are a Christian, a European pagan, or simply someone who values heroism and traditional virtues, the best vessel going forward is the tribe. It gives you a basis of power, a structure through which to preserve your traditions, and a coherent cultural framework that can be passed from generation to generation. It is the best way to secure an inheritance for your children and their descendants. And it is the only way to secure the ancestral chain of being, that chain which Odysseus, Romulus and Remus, and Sigmund and Sinfjotli all fought to restore. And this is why I named this channel The Ark all those years ago. The idea is that we're living through a cultural and civilizational collapse, something equivalent to the Great Flood. And it is our job to build vessels that will carry the ancient culture and traditions of the West, the ancestral flame, through that flood, so that when the flood passes, we can, like Noah or Deucalion, build anew. The ultimate aim of a tribal network is to build a new aristocracy. Now that probably sounds extremely pretentious, but let me explain what exactly I mean. Every settled society or civilization of sufficient size will have an aristocracy. This is an absolute law of history. In the United States, for example, even though we're a democratic republic, we used to have an aristocracy, which was primarily WASP. When a society's aristocracy is overthrown, as in the French Revolution or the communist revolutions, a new aristocracy is inevitably formed by the rebels themselves. Whenever you have a settled society of sufficient size, there will be a class of people who wield power and who are in charge. And that class will share some sort of cultural, ethnic, or ideological framework, usually a mix of all of those things, which defines them and holds them together as a ruling class. That is simply inevitable. When I talk about aristocracy on this channel, people will sometimes comment that it is either undesirable or impossible in modernity. But like I said, every single society has an aristocracy, even if you don't call it that, even if it is invisible, including all Western societies today. The aristocracy of the modern West is the liberal elite, and they are remarkably unified across countries. They're not so much unified by race or class, although these things can factor in, but by their shared ideology, which we see across every Western country. Almost everyone in a position of power or influence in a Western government or Western culture, political officials, NGO directors, actors, journalists, no matter their background, will almost all universally espouse the same ideology, the same narrative, the same values. Now, of course, there is growing dissent, and various factions are attempting to form a counter-elite. Trump tried to do this with the MAGA coalition, but was largely absorbed back into the old establishment. But the point is that every society has an elite. Every society has an aristocracy. It's pointless to try to create a society without one. Even in communist societies, you have aristocracies and elite rule. So what you want, then, is an aristocracy that represents your interests, provides protection for you, and ideally embodies, at least in theory, the highest ideals of your society. This is exactly what we find in ancient pagan literature, like the stories I've been talking about, which are almost entirely concerned with people of royal birth, with kings and heroes descended from the gods. This is not a coincidence. When they told stories of Odysseus, Achilles, Sigurd, Sigmund, great heroes exemplifying the highest virtues of their societies, with the divine blood of the gods running through their veins, it only made sense that these men should be kings. They didn't find this to be classist or exclusionary. Quite the contrary, they found it to be desirable that their aristocracy, their rulers, their founders, their heroes, should represent the best and highest ideals of their society. That the best should always be at the top, protecting, providing for, and symbolically representing the whole. This really is the ideal state of society. You want an aristocracy that you can admire, that provides ideals towards which you can strive, and which has your interests at heart. The problem in the West today is that our elite is actively working against us. The elite of England seek to break down English identity, destroy English sovereignty, block the English from meaningful political representation, to destroy their country economically, demographically. And to one degree or another, this is the case in almost every Western country. Again and again, the people vote against policies that harm them, such as mass migration or foreign wars. Yet again and again, those policies are imposed by the elite anyway. And this is another archetype which we were just talking about, the tyrannical usurper, the rightful king overthrown. Our elite is currently playing the role of Koryos, devouring their own people. And because of these circumstances, it is inevitable that this elite will eventually be overthrown. If they are not, they will run our countries into the ground and be consumed in the resulting chaos anyway. New elites then will form, whether in the wake of total collapse, as happened in Western Rome, or through political and cultural revolution. Obviously, it's better if we don't have to go through the whole collapse, dark age, war, violence thing, and we can just turn our countries around through political means. But the point is that no matter what, new elites will be forming in the next 100 years or so. And strong networks and tribes will be the foundation of these new elites. We actually have a blueprint for this in European pagan literature as well. In the Aeneid, the Trojan homeland is destroyed and sacked by the Greeks, but the Trojan hero Aeneas takes his gods, gathers his family and the survivors of his people, and leads them on a journey across the sea to Italy, where they lay the foundations of what will become the Roman Empire. Thus, the Trojan aristocracy, according to myth of course, became the Roman aristocracy, with Julius and Augustus Caesar being distant descendants of Aeneas and his son Iulus. This is a myth, of course, but in the Aeneid, the Trojans deploy the exact strategy that the Jews historically deployed, taking their gods from the temples with them and journeying across the world before settling in a new land. And we see the same pattern historically with the Germanic tribes, especially the Goths, when they were uprooted and displaced from their homeland on the steppe by the Huns. And this is the historical backdrop for the saga of the Volsungs. The son of Sigmund, who we talked about earlier, is Sigurd, Siegfried in German, the famous dragon-slaying hero. He is born into a world where the fabric of society is already irrevocably ruptured. He inherits a curse that began long before him from the dragon Fafnir's gold, and he is betrayed and deceived by everyone around him. He is a hero abiding by the old honor codes in a world that no longer upholds them, like Odysseus in the Cyclops cave, a man of virtue in a society that has collapsed into a state of nature. And because of this, he is betrayed and killed. What's so fascinating about this is that the saga represents historical reality encoded in myth and legend, a memory of the time when the old pagan Germanic order on the steppe and the continent was crumbling under the pressure of the migration period, the Huns, the Romans, and the collapse of the Roman order. Yet in the saga of the Volsungs, the daughter of Sigurd, Aslog, survives, living among peasants in obscurity. Again, we might recall the myth of Romulus and Remus, who are raised in the woods by a shepherd. She eventually marries the Danish Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok, and they have a son named Sigurd after his grandfather. Thus, the great bloodline descended from Odin, which had run through the aristocracy of the pagan Germanic steppe, survived its collapse and flowed again through the aristocracy of the Viking Age. Again, this is legend, but it maps onto history. While the Germanic pagan order collapsed on the continent, giving way to the medieval Christian order, the Norse preserved that pagan spirit well into the Middle Ages. They would become the aristocracies of many regions in Northern Europe, and it was the Norse settlers of Iceland who wrote these stories down and preserved them for us. And it is these stories that give us our blueprint for surviving the modern world. They are not relics of the past, they are a living tradition, directly relevant to us today. Again, this is why I spend so much time on them. And if you want a detailed breakdown of all of the works I've been discussing, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Saga of the Volsungs, the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the entire Norse legendary cycle, and the entire Greco-Roman epic cycle, check out my heroic literature course. I'm about to post the final episode in the Norse section. It's going to be on Beowulf. And there are already 20 episodes for you to listen to, each running roughly 35 minutes to an hour. You can find the course as well as my community via the link in the description if you're interested. So what can you take from all of this practically? We are not living in a civilization. We are living in the wilderness, in the state of nature. And the sooner that you accept that and understand it, the better. This does not mean abandoning virtue or tradition. It simply means that you have to understand Odysseus' error when he expected Polyphemus to play by the same rules which he did. In a world where every other group operates tribally, you cannot be naive or you will be eaten. You must be crafty, like Odysseus. You must learn to live like Sigmund and Sinfjotli or Romulus and Remus in the wilderness, not because this is the end goal, but because it is what the moment demands. The Mannerbund is not an end in itself, it is a vessel. Find your tribe, train together, build wealth together, have each other's backs, preserve the ancestral flame, read the old stories, live by the old values, raise children who know who they are and where they come from. Our ancient stories are not fairy tales. They are instruction manuals for surviving the collapse of civilization and for building a new order. And perhaps, if you play your cards right, it is you, or your children, or your grandchildren, will stand when the destruction passes as the aristocracy of a new age. This could happen in 100 years, or it could happen in 10. So prepare yourself, and never stop striving for the heroic ideal, for that North Star that has guided our ancestors since the Bronze Age.
If you're interested in a detailed exploration of the Greco-Roman epic cycle and the Norse sagas, follow the link in the description to check out the ARC's heroic literature course.